Hi again, guys. We're going to take a second look in this lecture at Aristotle's Poetics. And then I think we will have spent enough time with this text in this part of our course, as you guys will be aware by this point when we are reading Aristotle. We are reading something that is certainly difficult, intellectually challenging. It's also just kind of challenging in terms of the kind of text it is, the kind of reading experience that we are having when we are reading Aristotle. It is not the kind of experience, let's say, for which we sign up to take English courses. As a rule, we are accustomed to reading stuff that captivates us, delights us, pleases us in various ways. Aristotle is not like that. The text is obviously very dry. It's also, in a weird way, just, well, difficult to follow. It's quite convoluted, Aristotle's discussion, perhaps especially in the Poetics, although this is a general characteristic, I would say, of Aristotle's intellectual style or argumentative style. That is to say, a general characteristic of the Aristotelian texts themselves. And actually there is a kind of historical reason for that. It seems to be the case that most of what we have of Aristotle, apart from the fact that it's gone through multiple translations and redactions and transmissions over the centuries, but it seems to be the case that in the first place, the Aristotelian texts are not actually written down by the man himself. They're written down by his students, gathered up from lecture notes, that kind of thing. So that's, I guess, quite a nightmarish way for any philosophy to come to the page, and I think that's one reason why when we are reading Aristotle, and the Poetics is a very good example of this, when we are reading Aristotle, we often have to kind of untangle the argument, because he'll start to talk about one thing and it will lead into another topic which doesn't necessarily seem to connect to the first thing, and then he kind of finds his way back. So what kind of text? Dry, difficult, convoluted, even tangled. But in our course, History and Principles of Literary Criticism, we really have no choice but to try to have at least a brief encounter with Aristotle's Poetics, and that's because, first of all, it actually is an ancient work of literary criticism / literary theory, so that's our ball game, so to speak. Also because this text, Aristotle's Poetics, has been, in the history of thinking about literature, in Western culture at least, has been extremely influential, not continuously from ancient times, but beginning in the Renaissance, when Aristotle's Poetics was rediscovered, precisely at a time, of course, when the literatures of the various European languages were attaining a new sophistication, a new self-awareness, and Aristotle's Poetics was extremely influential in that phase of historical and cultural development. So we gotta try to deal with Aristotle. What I want to do in this second lecture, and it is not, of course, the way in which I generally like to proceed, but I want to try to deal with this material in what perhaps we can think of as an Aristotelian fashion, and that is to say, I want to proceed quite systematically and just try to give as clear an account as I can of what we're getting from Aristotle's Poetics and why we need to get whatever we're getting from this text. So I'm going to be arranging what I have to say in this lecture under three categories, very Aristotelian. Three categories which I take it are aligned in a kind of ascending order of interest. So from dry to less dry, from perhaps a little bit boring to, I think, quite interesting at the end. First of all, I just want to talk about some basic concepts and terms, very, very basic concepts and terms for almost any discussion of literature, which we get from Aristotle. Second, I want to go on and just observe the very astute, very acute analysis that Aristotle will tend to give of a number of the terms that and concepts that he introduces and puts on the table. And finally, and this is where I think things do become quite a bit more compelling, maybe fascinating, I want to return to what I was talking about in the last lecture, which is Aristotle's very famous and I think very profound remarks about the nature and the purpose of tragedy. Okay, so that's the plan. So first of all, basic terms and concepts that we find being put on the table for us by Aristotle in the Poetics. These are terms, concepts that we almost certainly take for granted as essential or necessary or ubiquitous whenever we are talking about literature and art very broadly. What I want to emphasize and underline, and it's a simple point really, but it's just that we take these terms and concepts for granted in part because of Aristotle's Poetics and the tradition of talking about literature that comes out of and is influenced by Aristotle's Poetics. So I'm talking about concepts like character, about which Aristotle has quite a bit to say. I'm talking about concepts like plot, a very important topic for Aristotle in this text. I'm talking about concepts like unity. Aristotle has quite a bit to say about the concept of the unity of a literary work, how it holds together, how it makes sense. Even concepts like magnitude. How long should a given work be? And I just have a couple of other things here before things start to get a little bit more interesting, I think. In section 3 of the version of the text that we have, in section 3, Aristotle goes into a discussion of what he calls the medium of a literary work, its objects and its manner. And I don't want actually to quote that section or work with it very closely here, but the point I simply want to make is that Aristotle is, again, introducing a totally basic concept that we now take for granted, which is to say he's introducing a concept of genre, or perhaps we might say mode. So he's pointing out, again, very simply, but in a way that is, I think, worthwhile, he's pointing out that you can tell the same stuff, the same story, in a narrative form, or you can tell it in the drama. So the objects, which is to say the content of the story is the same, but the manner of its presentation is different. A totally basic and ubiquitous point, but it's one that is ubiquitous in part because of the treatment that Aristotle gives to it in this very, very famous, influential ancient text. Okay, still under this heading of terms and concepts that that the tradition, let's say, takes for granted coming out of Aristotle's Poetics, I want to go on and talk about two other basic concepts which are, let's say, implicit in Aristotle's discussion, but they are very, very important, and it's really worth our while to get clear about them, let's say. The first one that I want to introduce here is what I'm going to call vaguely a concept of poetic imagination. Now, that's not a term that Aristotle uses, and he doesn't actually give any term to kind of cover this, but it is something that he, I think, very clearly is talking about. And again, it's very, very important, very influential. And we're going to hear echoes of Aristotle, for example, when we come to read Sir Philip Sidney in a few weeks on exactly this point. So now I am actually going to quote from our text. I'm going to quote from section 9 of Aristotle's Poetics in the version of the text that we have, where Aristotle says, "It is moreover evident from what has been said that it is not the function of the poet to relate what has happened, but what may happen, what is possible, according to the law of probability or necessity. The poet and the historian differ not by writing in verse or in prose. The work of Herodotus might be put into verse, and it would still be a species of history with meter, no less than without it. The true difference is that one relates what has happened, the other what may happen. Poetry, therefore, is a more philosophical and a higher thing than history, for poetry tends to express the universal, history the particular." So Aristotle is working here from a comparison, which becomes, again, a very famous, very canonical comparison between poetry, literature broadly, let's say, and historical narrative. This is a comparison which emerges, I think, in kind of an obvious way, because, historians write too. Historians tell stories too, don't they? And certainly in ancient times, the distinction between historical narrative and fiction is in some ways much less clearly drawn than we think it is today. So it's as though Aristotle is answering kind of a question. Well, isn't poetry just kind of the same as writing history? And Aristotle wants to answer that question very clearly and roundly. No, they are not the same. Moreover, he wants to make very clear that the difference between poetry and history is not just a matter of style or form. As he puts it very nicely there, the ancient historian Herodotus would still be an historian if he were doing his stuff in rhythmic poetry, in meter. What matters here, Aristotle is saying, is the kind of stuff that gets talked about, the content, let's say, the subject matter of poetry versus history. And the point that he wants to make there, which I think is a very important and certainly is a very famous and influential one, is that poetry, so to speak, is not limited by the facts. The particular, as Aristotle puts it there. Poetry is not just trying to describe events, not just trying to say what has happened, but is trying, as it were, to see into the nature of events and of the world, to say what can or may happen, to articulate, maybe we could say, a kind of law of the world or of behavior, unfettered by actual empirical details of what has happened in time. And accordingly, Aristotle makes this statement that poetry is, as he puts it, a higher and more philosophical thing than the writing of history. So there's an insight there into the importance of literature, which remains perhaps somewhat obscure and somewhat tantalizing. So we might say to Aristotle, well, what do you mean poetry is high and philosophical in a way that history writing is not? It's not clear that he necessarily is giving a clear answer to that question. What he is doing, and this is the point that I'm trying to emphasize, is he is laying down in the tradition exactly that idea, exactly that gut feeling, let's say, that there's something high and philosophical going on in literature which is not necessarily going on in the writing of history. And insofar as Aristotle is able to explain that insight, he does so by appealing to the freedom of poetry, of literature, to make stuff up. So that's why I say this comes under a heading of poetic imagination. And in that freedom to make stuff up, to see into what can or may or should or ought to happen, in precisely that creative freedom, Aristotle says, poetry reaches for what he calls the universal, as opposed to the focus on the particular in history. So that I'm putting all of that stuff under the heading of, again, poetic imagination. That is an idea that emerges from the Poetics and, of course, becomes very influential, very famous, and even, let's say, ubiquitous in discussions of literature. And then there's one more of these concepts that I want to draw out of Aristotle's discussion. This is not a concept to which he gives a term, but it is a concept, and a very important one, to which a term, a vocabulary, will be given in the literary tradition relating to the Poetics, and certainly this is the case in the Renaissance. And we'll be coming back to this term, which is why I want to introduce it now. I'm going to be quoting, again, several places from the Poetics. I'm going to quote from sections 2, 5, and 15. So this is a very nice example of the way in which Aristotle's discussion is convoluted or tangled. You almost want to kind of take it apart and put it back together again, which I guess is what we're doing here. So first I'm going to quote from section 2, where Aristotle is talking about the objects of imitation. In other words, what stuff literature is about, the objects of imitation. He says, since the objects of imitation are men in action, and these men must be either of a higher or a lower type, for moral character mainly answers to these divisions, goodness and badness being the distinguishing marks of moral differences, it follows that we must represent men either as better than in real life, or as worse, or as they are. And he goes on to give several examples of what he's talking about. It may not sound as though he is talking about very much there. But the point I want to go on to make is that he is talking about a very important concept. But first, 2 more quotations before I try to say what that concept is. The second quotation I have here is then from section 5, where Aristotle is talking about a couple of distinctions between comedy, epic, and tragedy. He says, comedy is an imitation of characters of a lower type. Epic poetry agrees with tragedy insofar as it is an imitation in verse of characters of a higher type. And the final quotation I have here is from section 15, where Aristotle writes, or says, Aristotle says, in respect of character, there are 4 things to be aimed at. First and most important, it must be good. Now, any speech or action that manifests moral purpose of any kind will be expressive of character. The character will be good if the purpose is good. This rule is relative to each class. Even a woman may be good, and also a slave, though the woman may be said to be an inferior being and the slave quite worthless. And we certainly can pause there to dump on Aristotle just as much as we like for being a sexist, patriarchal jerk, and also for living in a slave society, which ancient Athens was, and assuming, as Aristotle does, that such a society is normal and natural. Let's dump on him all we want for that, while nonetheless trying to recover the actual point that is available here for our purposes about literary criticism. So he goes on to say the second thing to aim at is propriety. He talks about manly valor. He talks about an idea of appropriateness in the representation of character. What's appropriate for this kind of character, for that kind of character, and so on and so forth. These quotations, and there are others, but these will serve. These quotations in the Poetics, they're places where Aristotle is talking about concepts of hierarchy. He's talking about high type characters, low type characters. He's talking about concepts of appropriateness. What kind of behavior is appropriate for a high type character or a low type character? What kind of genre is appropriate for a high type character or a low type character? And by this high and low metaphor, which is what it is, we're talking about social class and social standing. To be completely clear about this, and it is, I guess, a point worth being completely clear about, what Aristotle is talking about here is certainly not something that I am selling, so to speak, and I wouldn't even say that it is something that that needs to be observed in literature, let's say. Aristotle, however, thinks that this stuff he's talking about needs to be observed or ought to be observed in literature for it to be as good as it can be. So he thinks he's both observing and laying down a kind of rule here for the way characters should be thought of and represented. The concept that emerges out of this discussion in the Poetics and from some other ancient sources which we're not reading, the concept that emerges here, it's a very, very important one. It's the concept of decorum, okay? Very, very influential in the Renaissance and beyond. The idea of decorum is an idea of there being a hierarchy of styles, an idea of fitting style to subject matter, and an idea of appropriateness of character, appropriateness in which a character is represented. So, hierarchy of styles. What that means, for example, is under this kind of ancient rule, which is what it is, of decorum. That means that if, for example, you are writing a tragedy, which is thought of as the kind of highest literary form, you should write in the highest style possible. So you need to use fancy language, impressive, powerful rhetoric, and you should have high-class characters in your tragedy. There shouldn't be any shop clerks or indeed slaves in Aristotle's terms in your tragedy. It should be all high-style figures. Your high-class characters in your tragedy should only behave in ways that are appropriate to high-class characters. The hero of a tragedy, the tragic hero, should never slip on a banana peel, for example. And conversely, in comedy, everything should be very low and goofy and, farty and all that kind of stuff. So hierarchy of styles, fitting style to subject matter, and a concept of appropriateness in the representation of character. All of that stuff that Aristotle is talking about here, it comes under this very important heading of decorum. Again, that becomes a basic concept in later literary analysis, which is coming really in the first place out of the Poetics and a couple of other ancient sources, as I said. Okay, as we proceed through our very Aristotelian account of Aristotle, that concludes the first part of what I said I wanted to talk about, basic concepts, basic terms for the discussion of literature which come to us out of the Poetics. So now I'll go on to my second topic, which is about the very, as I said, astute, acute, which is to say detailed, sharp, insightful analysis that Aristotle does give vis-a-vis a number of the basic concepts and terms that he has introduced. And again, I'm going to quote some passages here, not so much because I think we need these specific insights that Aristotle has, but rather in a more general way, just to point out the again, very productive, very detailed, very sharp kind of analysis that he is able to give. So, for example, in section 5, here Aristotle is talking about the contrast and comparison between tragedy and epic, where he writes, "Epic poetry agrees with tragedy insofar as it is an imitation in verse of characters of a higher type." There's that decorum idea again, right? They differ, epic and tragedy, they differ in that epic poetry admits but one kind of meter and is narrative in form. They differ again in their length. For tragedy endeavors as far as possible to confine itself to a single revolution of the sun, or but slightly to exceed this limit, whereas the epic action has no limits of time. Of their constituent parts, some are common to both, some peculiar to tragedy. Whoever therefore knows what is good or bad tragedy knows also about epic poetry. All the elements of an epic poem are found in tragedy, but the elements of a tragedy are not all found in the epic poem. Very, very nice bit of Aristotelian analysis where he is proceeding again by division and comparison. It can seem very dry and not very momentous, but it eventuates, I think, in a wonderful, compelling, although limited insight that he offers at the end of that passage, where he points out that tragedy contains everything that is in epic, but not the other way around. Epic does not contain everything that is in tragedy. A very nice kind of Venn diagram way of thinking about it. And what it means for Aristotle, of course, is that tragedy is actually the highest form because it contains everything that every other form has, plus even more. And in a passage like that one, I think Aristotle takes it that the very detailed, very careful analysis that he provides is supposed to be capable of precisely proving that point. The point that tragedy is the highest of all literary forms. A second quotation that I have here for the detailed productivity of Aristotle's analysis. It's from section 7, and it's where he's talking about the nature of poetic unity, the nature of a poetic whole. Unity being one of those cliche, ubiquitous literary concepts that Aristotle is indeed introducing and getting on the table, more or less for the first place. We might well ask, okay, what the heck does that mean? Aristotle is going to answer us in section 7. Again, he's talking about tragedy, and he writes, "Tragedy is an imitation of an action that is complete and whole and of a certain magnitude. For there may be a whole that is wanting in magnitude. A whole is that which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A beginning is that which does not itself follow anything by causal necessity, but after which something naturally is or comes to be. An end, on the contrary, is that which itself naturally follows some other thing, either by necessity or as a rule, but has nothing following it. A middle is that which follows something as some other thing follows it. A well-constructed plot, therefore, must neither begin nor end at haphazard, but conform to these principles." Now, I think this is a quintessentially Aristotelian passage, and as such, of course, a very smart one and a very patient one. Aristotle, as I was suggesting in the last lecture, Aristotle is not one of those philosophers who goes through the world wild-eyed and tearing his hair out. Aristotle is rather the kind of philosopher who is calmly sitting back behind his desk, perhaps with his arms folded, looking up at the ceiling of his office, and carefully and effectively answering any questions you might put to him, however irritated you might be when you are putting the questions. So, for example, Aristotle tells us, well, a work of art should be a whole, it should be a unity. And we might say, in boredom and frustration, okay, what the heck do you mean by that, Aristotle? Aristotle says, well, what I mean is it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. We might roll our eyes and say, oh my gosh, what the heck, what is that even telling us? What's a beginning, Aristotle? Aristotle is going to have an answer for that. He's going to have an answer for what an end is. He's going to have an answer, too, for what a middle is. If we ask him what he means, he calmly tells us, here's what I mean, and gives us a definition of unity, which turns out to be, let's say, not boring or uninteresting or tautological, but rather quite informative. And I think that's pretty darned good, actually. And the last quote that I have under this subheading of Aristotle's acute, detailed, insightful analysis, it's in section 8, or from section 8, where Aristotle is talking about unity of plot. Plot, as you guys know from the reading, is a very, very important concept for Aristotle. It all comes down to plot for him. Certainly tragedy, as we'll see again in a moment, all comes down to plot for Aristotle. But he promulgates, I guess, what we can actually call a theory of literature in general, in which if we want to write something and call it literary, what we need to focus on, according to Aristotle, is not what we might think, not character, for example, which for Aristotle is a subsidiary or a secondary phenomenon. what we need to focus on, first of all, is the plot. What happens? And in this section, this selection from section 8, Aristotle is talking about unity of plot. He states, unity of plot does not, as some persons think, consist in the unity of the hero. For infinitely various are the incidents in one man's life which cannot be reduced to unity, and so too there are many actions of one man out of which we cannot make one action. And he gives some examples of people kind of doing this the wrong way, trying to tell everything that happens in a person's life and thinking that will make a unified story or unified work. I think this is a very nice insight, actually, that we have from Aristotle. And I think we could easily come up with examples of where this rule that he's laying down is not followed, and in fact it doesn't work very well. Not following the rule, I mean. And we can talk about this more in tutorial, but for example, think of the phenomenon of the biopic, the biographical movie with which we're all very familiar. And there are some biopics which really work, and you come out of the theater or walk away from Netflix or whatever thinking, wow, that was really cool. There are others that are just so meandering and pointless, and if we think about it, I think we'll probably discover, or if we engage in some analysis even of those works, I think we'll probably discover that what happens in those less than successful biopics is precisely that the writer and the director just try to tell everything that happened in the person's life, as though that will bring unity in and of itself. And of course it doesn't. Anyway, so Aristotle gives a couple of his own examples of people doing this wrong, not understanding unity of plot. And then he turns to Homer, who he says does a very good job. So he says, Homer, as in all else he is of surpassing merit, here too, whether from art or natural genius, seems to have happily discerned the truth. In composing the Odyssey, he did not include all the adventures of Odysseus. So Aristotle is making the point that even though there's a lot of stories about Odysseus in the Odyssey, that's only a fraction of all the stories that are told about Odysseus in Greek mythology. Homer has selected the stories that he wants to tell and woven them together into a whole. So in composing the Odyssey, he did not include all the adventures of Odysseus, incidents between which there is no necessary or probable connection, but he made the Odyssey, and likewise the Iliad, to center around an action that in our sense of the word is one. As therefore in the other imitative arts, the imitation is one when the object imitated is one, so the plot, being an imitation of an action, must imitate one action, and that a whole. And of course, if you want to know what a whole or a unity is, all you have to do is go back to the previous section of Aristotle's discussion where he explained exactly that. So that stuff, very detailed, very acute, very productive and insightful kind of analysis that Aristotle is able to provide, I think is pretty darned good stuff, and certainly very famous and very influential. Okay, let's go on to the third part of our look, our second and last look at Aristotle's Poetics. And this has to do with what I have, the heading on my page says tragedy stuff. Which is all I've really got for a heading here. All of the stuff that Aristotle says about tragedy. He talks about tragedy a lot in the Poetics. In terms of our selection, I asked you guys to read up to section 18 in our version of the text. And as far as I can tell from my count, Aristotle starts talking about tragedy in section 6. He talks about tragedy in section 7, 9, 10, 11, 13, 14, and 16, and that list may not be exhaustive. And by the way, you do not have to remember in which sections Aristotle talks about tragedy. That will not be on the exam. What I would like you to remember is that Aristotle is fascinated by tragedy. And as I was suggesting in the last lecture, I would even say, and I think this is a wonderful thing, actually, in the Poetics, even kind of a moving thing in the Poetics. And it does not happen that often in reading Aristotle that you feel moved. emotionally. It is a fascinating and even a moving thing that tragedy, I think, scrambles Aristotle's circuits a little bit. He is, again, the kind of philosopher who wants to proceed descriptively, dispassionately, systematically, through careful categorical division, observing and labeling and articulating all the parts of whatever he's talking about and putting them up on the bookshelf once he has completed that work. I think tragedy does not quite let Aristotle do that, and I think that is a very, very cool thing. And again, the relevant, the inevitable contrast is back to Plato and Plato's Socrates. And, we might think about what kind of audience member Plato's Socrates would have been when he goes to the theater to see a tragedy, or perhaps goes to a performance of a rhapsode. And we might suspect that Plato's Socrates would have been a pretty terrible audience member, in the sense that he precisely does not want to get involved with what happens in those scenarios of artistic and dramatic performance. Socrates might be the guy who's sitting in the theater of Dionysus, watching Oedipus the king, surrounded by people who are just completely losing their shit, if you'll forgive my Greek, as the tragedy unfolds, crying and falling over and sweating. Plato's Socrates, I think, is going to say to himself, I don't like this. I don't like what's going on here. And accordingly, he tries to give us that theory, as we have seen, that there is actually something wrong with what goes on in the scenario of literature, and it shouldn't be allowed in a well-ordered state. Aristotle, the empiricist, the descriptive philosopher, the systematic philosopher, Aristotle is completely different. If Aristotle's at that theater, I think, if Aristotle's watching the rhapsode, I'm not sure if he's going to lose his such and such, but I am pretty sure Aristotle's going to say, wow, there is something going on here. Something that is manifestly and clearly worthy of our attention. And since we Aristotelians want to provide a systematic account of things, well, we got to provide an account of this because it is clearly important. Accordingly, Aristotle, as I've said, comes back to tragedy again and again and again, and I'm not going to be able here to kind of empty the watering can of everything Aristotle says about tragedy. We can come back to that in tutorial, but I just want to highlight a few points in his discussion. I'm not going to quote them. I'm just going to point to them at this point in this lecture. So, for example, Aristotle has some, I think, amazingly insightful comments on the nature of a tragic hero. This will be, for the most part, in section 13 of our text. Aristotle insists, in a way that is sort of interestingly, well, if not contradictory, it's at least in a little bit of tension with what Aristotle has said earlier about high and low types of character. Remember, that came under the heading of what I'm calling decorum, what the tradition calls decorum. And there's that whole insistence that characters in a tragedy should be high-type characters. In section 13, Aristotle says something slightly different. He says, well, actually, the tragic hero, he can't be all bad, because then you don't care what happens to him. He can't be all good, or it just won't make any sense. He can't be like supernaturally super duper, or you won't feel like you have any contact with him. He can't be just a kind of low-class scumbag, because then the same problem will arise. Aristotle concludes, well, the tragic hero has to be kind of a middle type of person. It's kind of a Goldilocks theory he has, actually, of the tragic hero. Not too great, not too bad, not too impressive, not too unimpressive. He needs to be the tragic hero. To use a word that I think I have made my peace with, even though it is not a word and never will be, but never mind. The tragic hero, Aristotle is saying in section 13, needs to be, quote unquote, relatable, okay? Because if he isn't, you won't feel for him or her. And of course, in Aristotle's account, you must take what happens to the hero of a tragedy very, very personally. You must take it to heart. So, wonderful comments on the nature of the tragic hero in section 13. In section 6, as we've already mentioned, Aristotle gives a very, very fine, I think, discussion of a plot being the central aspect of a tragedy. It's about plot. It's not about character, not primarily. Section 7, he goes into the proper structure of plot. Some very cool remarks. Section 9 and 10, sections 9 and 10, Aristotle gets into something which again he doesn't himself seem completely in control of, and this is where I think the text really does start to become very, very cool, very interesting. It's where Aristotle is talking. He advances a distinction, as he does, right, between two kinds of plots, what he calls a simple tragic plot and what he calls a complex tragic plot. The idea of the simple tragic plot, which Aristotle introduces in section 9, basically seems to revolve around a notion of surprise. And he gives an example of the kind of story in which the bad guy is killed by a statue falling on him. You go, ah! Didn't see that coming. The effect of the tragedy occurs through surprise. And Aristotle says, yeah, that's pretty good when that happens. That's a pretty cool effect. But it is not as cool as what happens in a complex plot, tragic plot. And what's a complex tragic plot? Well, that is precisely the kind where what happens to the tragic hero is not a surprise. And you guys, I think we are at this point with Aristotle on very, very fascinatingly shifting sands. He has an insight here which I think is inexhaustibly fascinating, and one that I hope we can come back to and discuss in tutorial. The difference between a surprise ending and a non-surprise ending of a work as a whole or any part of a work. And there are many, many examples that we can call up, both from literary tradition and probably also from our own cinematic experience, which will allow us to meditate a bit more on that Aristotelian distinction between the simple and the complex plot. Okay, let's wrap up. Ultimately, and I'm now going to repeat, I hope a bit more clearly, some stuff that I said in the last lecture. It's very complicated, very tantalizing, very mercurial stuff, and very insightful, and that's why I think it is worth repeating. Aristotle, as I think I was saying in the last lecture, Aristotle ultimately has an answer to, gives an answer to the question of our course, what is literature good for? At least if we substitute tragedy, which he thinks is the highest form of literature, in that question. What is tragedy good for? Tragedy, as I was saying last time, being an immensely important artistic, also sacred, also civic ritual aspect of ancient Athenian life. Why do you do that to yourself? Go to watch Oedipus the King and lose it in the theater. Aristotle has a very clear answer. He says tragedy is for what he calls catharsis. We don't have the Greek term in our text, but I do want to introduce it and the others. Catharsis, purging. We go to the tragedy, Aristotle says, people go to the tragedy to be purged of negative emotions. in particular to be purged of terror and pity, in the Greek phobos and elios. The model that Aristotle gives us, again, is one in which we watch a tragedy which contains, in its story, contains elements of terror and pity, phobos and elios. Watching that tragedy makes us feel mimetically that very emotional content that is represented on the stage, and when we feel that, we experience catharsis. We are purged, and for Aristotle, accordingly, if there is an actual, not only emotional but actual physical discharge from the audience members of a tragedy, tears, saliva, vomit, who knows what else comes out if you're an ancient Athenian watching Oedipus the King. Aristotle, Plato's Socrates is going to look at that happening in the pews beside him. Oh my gosh, this is horrible. People are losing their dignity. Aristotle is going to look at that happening and say, yes, that's exactly how it's supposed to go. These people, these audience members of the tragedy, are experiencing what they need, and what they need is catharsis, that purging of Elios and Phobos. And the last point, again, we've made it before, but it's worth repeating and worth discussing, I think, in tutorial. Aristotle also, of course, gives an account of how the tragedy achieves that. As is often the case in Aristotle, he's kind of proceeding on two levels, or proceeding from one level to another. The first level being what we can call a descriptive level. So Aristotle wants to just say how a good tragedy works, how a good tragedy manages to produce its effect of Elios and Phobos, and therefore generate catharsis in the audience members. But of course, precisely by saying how a good tragedy works, Aristotle moves to another level where he is, in effect, saying what constitutes a good tragedy. And therefore, we move from a descriptive level, just saying what it is, to a prescriptive level, which means saying how it should be or needs to be. Aristotle ends up giving rules, in other words, for how a tragedy should work. And whether or not we accept those rules or find them compelling, we certainly need to know about them. And I certainly would argue that there is a great deal of insight in these rules that Aristotle gives. How should a tragedy generate its catharsis? Well, again, Aristotle has a clear answer to that. He says a tragedy does that through two key elements of its plot. The first is recognition, or in the Greek, anagnorisis. And I'll be putting these terms on canvas, so don't worry about them for the moment. The second element is peripeteia, or reversal of fortune. Aristotle observes, says, argues that in a really awesome tragedy, what generates the catharsis is precisely the moment in the plot where the tragic hero suddenly realizes, recognizes his fate or some aspect of his fate. So that's, you watch that and you go, oh, you experience that terror and pity. It's even better, even cooler, Aristotle says, if the recognition happens at exactly the moment in the plot when the tragic hero is expecting a given outcome and receives exactly the opposite outcome. And the example that Aristotle gives, with which you guys are familiar from the BBC film that we watched, the example Aristotle gives, a very famous one, is from Sophocles' Oedipus the King, when the messenger comes from Corinth. Oedipus at that point in the play is just wound up in a state of appalling anxiety and distress at what he already thinks he understands about the nature of his terrible fate. He's terribly worried about that part of the prophecy controlling him, which states that he's going to kill his father. The messenger comes from Corinth with this news that the king of Corinth, Polybus, is dead. Oedipus thinks Polybus is his father. Oedipus is like, great, my dad's dead. I'm free from my prophecy. At that moment, he thinks everything is going to turn out well, but at exactly that moment, Aristotle loves this, right? At exactly that moment, the messenger says, what? You thought Polybus was your father? Oh, no, no, no. Don't worry about that. He wasn't your dad. So the messenger thinks he's bringing good news to Oedipus. Oedipus thinks he's about to receive good news, but it turns out to be the very opposite, the worst possible news he could receive, leading him to the realization that the old man he killed at the crossroads many years before, that was actually his father, etc., etc., etc. Okay. That is enough for this second and last lecture on Aristotle's Poetics. I apologize for proceeding in this kind of very dry, systematic way, but as I think we have seen, Aristotle makes us do that. I think there is a great deal of stuff here still for us to talk about in tutorial this week. Next week, I'll be going on to talk about our reading from Augustine on Christian doctrine, and we have a few selections from the book of Genesis as well, which we'll also discuss because they're what Augustine discusses. But for me and Aristotle, that is all.